On December 14th, 1903, Orville and Wilbur Wright made an important and historic flight that lasted just under 1 minute. For the previous 2 years, the Wright brothers, former printers and bicycle shop owners, had undertaken experiments involving manned flight, inspired by the work of Leonardo da Vinci and others. Kitty Hawk and Kill Devil Hills, the sites of the Wright brothers' experiments, were famous for their regular Atlantic breezes and high dunes, as well as for their more forgiving landing or crash landing sandy surfaces. In December of 1903, after 2 years of successful glider tests, the brothers tried their hand at the next logical step in manned flight: engine-powered aviation. The historic, though brief flight was only witnessed by a handful of people, but the accomplishment was one that shaped our world and influenced new ideas of exploration, travel, and defense. As the United States began to look to the sky, the innovators and originators of the United States Air Force surely had the words of Wilbur Wright in mind.
What is chiefly needed is skill rather than machinery.
I am an American airman. I am a warrior. I have answered my nation's call. I am an American airman. My mission is to fly, fight, and win. I am faithful to a proud heritage, a tradition of honor, and a legacy of valor. I am an American airman, guardian of freedom and justice, my nation's sword and shield, its sentry and avenger. I defend my country with my life. I am an American airman, wingman, leader, warrior. I will never leave an airman behind. I will never falter, and I will not fail.
The United States Air Force bears the motto, aim high, fly, fight, win. Air Force core functions today not only include nuclear deterrence operations, air superiority, and space superiority, but efforts to defend American computing networks from cyber attacks as well. In addition to new technologies being developed for unmanned or drone warfare, the Air Force has designated an entire unit, the 24th Air Force, to protect our nation's intelligence and secrets in cyberspace. To understand the future of our Air Force, we must take a look back at its humble beginnings. As early as the American Civil War, military strategists sought new routes to reconnaissance and defense. Many of these men trained their thinking skyward. On June 11, 1861, Professor Thaddeus C. Lowe was offered an audience with Secretary of War Simon Cameron and the President, Abraham Lincoln, to demonstrate the possibilities of balloon warfare and to vie for the position of Chief Aeronaut of the Union Army. During a demonstration of his balloon, the Enterprise, 5 days later, Lowe telegraphed a message to the President via a cable run from the ground to high above Washington, D.C. The demonstration all but ensured Lowe's position as Chief Aeronaut. Lowe established the Balloon Corps and initially built 7 balloons: the Eagle, Constitution, and Washington, which were smaller and intended for one pilot in harsher or windier conditions, and the Union, Excelsior, United States, and the Intrepid, which came to be Lowe's favorite. The balloon played a key role in the Battle of Fair Oaks, with its observations of Confederate troops saving General Samuel P. Heintzelman's army from certain defeat. While observation and reconnaissance provided by Lowe's balloons presented numerous advantages over the Confederate Army, they were not without their impediments. In order for a balloon to communicate via telegraph with the ground, it had to be engaged in what was called captive flight, which meant that the craft had to be tethered to the ground, and a ground crew had to be in constant service to the balloon. Even those balloons in free flight experienced problems. In Lowe's first free flight demonstration at the Battle of First Bull Run, the wind blew him off course, and Lowe, who was a civilian without uniform, could not land amongst Union encampments without risk of being shot at. He had to land behind enemy lines and wait for rescue. Still, the Balloon Corps pioneered advances that today we take for granted, such as the first aircraft carrier, when a converted coal barge was used to successfully transport the aircraft. The efforts of the Balloon Corps during the Civil War seemed to warrant further development of air surveillance and combat. In 1907, a special branch of the Signal Corps, known as the Aeronautical Division, was founded, consisting initially of only one officer and 2 enlisted men. In December of 1907, the department began to request bids for a heavier-than-air flying machine. The specifications were sent to known aviation experimenters countrywide, including the Wright brothers. The role of the Aeronautical Division was largely a developmental one. The aircraft purchased, developed, and flown were not used in any official military action. It wasn't until the formation of the newly dubbed Aviation Section in 1914 and the Punitive Expedition in 1916 that the first American aircraft would see combat. Since 1910, Mexico had been embroiled in a revolution, with many of the actions and skirmishes affecting American civilians, soldiers, and property in Mexico. Disappointed when the United States officially recognized Venustiano Carranza's national government, Pancho Villa led a group of Mexican rebels in a raid on the town of Columbus, New Mexico, on March 9, 1916, burning buildings, stealing horses and munitions, and attacking the U.S. 13th Cavalry Detachment, killing 8 soldiers and 10 civilians. In response, an order from President Woodrow Wilson sent Major General John J. Pershing with an expeditionary force of 4,800 men into Mexico to capture Villa. For the first time in history, the 1st Aero Squadron was deployed in support of Pershing's forces. The unit was outfitted with 8 Curtiss JN-3s, or Jennies as they were commonly known, and the aircraft were shipped in pieces to and assembled at Columbus on March 15th, reassembled that day, and then flew their first mission over enemy territory the very next day. The Sierra Madre Mountains proved too great an obstacle for the Jennies, and the turbulences in her passes proved too rough to handle. Missions flown from the base at Colonia du Blanc could only extend to a radius of just under 40 miles. The weather conditions in Mexico also wreaked havoc on the plane's propellers and other wooden parts. The punitive expedition was labeled a success, and the United States government learned a great deal about the requirements for armed air combat that would prove useful to aeronautics companies the world over, especially as Europe plunged into World War I.
I was gaining upon him every instant, and had my sights trained dead upon his seat before I fired my first shot. At 2,000 feet above the enemy's lines, I pulled up my headlong dive and watched the enemy machine continuing on its course. Curving slightly to the left, the fall circled a little to the south, and the next minute crashed onto the ground just at the edge of the woods, a mile inside their own lines. I had brought down my first enemy aeroplane and had not been subjected to a single shot.
Eddie Rickenbacker entered the air service when the United States officially declared war on Germany in 1917. In spite of Rickenbacker's lack of formal schooling, he entered as a sergeant first class due to his preternatural knowledge of engines and mechanics, a skill he had possessed since childhood. In all, Rickenbacker would log over 500 hours in the air and he shot down 26 enemy aircraft, a record that held until World War II. Rickenbacker and other flying aces became romantic figures during the First World War. The air ace wrote about his time in the air in several books, most notably in Fighting the Flying Circus, published just after the Great War, and the media and entertainment industries painted the picture of flying aces as that of modern-day knights, and their flying machines as their trusty steeds, braving the skies and certain death for the greater good. The exploits of fighter aces like Rickenbacker not only provided exciting stories for the citizens back home and abroad, but helped to solidify the purpose and usefulness of air combat. Nicknamed the father of the U.S. Air Force, Billy Mitchell entered World War I as a lieutenant colonel and soon became the first officer to make a flight over German lines. He established the first U.S. office for the aviation section in April of 1917. By September, Mitchell had attained the rank of Brigadier General, commanding all American air combat units in France. He then went on to lead nearly 1,500 British, French, and Italian aircraft in the air phase of the Battle of Saint-Michel, one of the first coordinated air-ground offensives in history. Every bit as daring as his friend Eddie Rickenbacker, Mitchell was a visionary who understood that aviation would be the future of warfare and believed that the force with superior air power would be one to reckon with.
If a nation ambitious for universal conquest gets off to a flying start in a war of the future, it may be able to control the whole world more easily than a nation has controlled a continent in the past.
In 1924, Mitchell went on a tour of the Hawaii and Pacific regions at the behest of Major General Mason Patrick. Mitchell returned with a report over 300 pages long, which predicted that not only would the United States enter a war with the nation of Japan, but also predicted the very attack on Pearl Harbor that would propel us into World War II, nearly 20 years before it happened. By the time Eddie Rickenbacker and Billy Mitchell made their way to the front lines of World War I, there had already been a squadron of volunteer American pilots fighting for the Allies, known as the Lafayette Escadrille. James R. McConnell, a sergeant pilot in the escadrille, wrote about his time in the air in his book, Flying for France. In the introduction, an unnamed writer describes the attitude and the outlook of McConnell and the countless other Americans willing to volunteer for the war effort, even as America still practiced neutrality.
The spirit which pervades them is something above the spirit of adventure that draws many to war. It is the spirit of a man who has found advancement of liberty and humanity, and is glad and proud to contribute what he can.
While thousands of men risked their lives on the front, in the trenches, and in the skies during World War I, the Medal of Honor was awarded to only 4 airmen. Captain Eddie Rickenbacker called Frank Luke Jr. the most daring aviator and greatest fighter pilot of the entire war, and Luke's record for confirmed enemy kills was second only to Rickenbacker's. Luke, the pilot for the 27th Aero Squadron, shot down 14 German balloons and 4 airplanes before he was felled by a single machine gun bullet during the first phase of the Meuse-Argonne offensive, becoming the first airman to receive the Medal of Honor. He was also posthumously awarded 2 Distinguished Service Crosses.
After having previously destroyed a number of enemy aircraft within 17 days, he voluntarily started on a patrol after German observation balloons. Though pursued by 8 German planes, which were protecting the enemy balloon line, he unhesitatingly attacked and shot down in flames 3 German balloons, being himself under heavy fire from ground batteries and the hostile planes. Severely wounded, he descended to within 50 meters of the ground, and flying at this low altitude near the town of Mervaux, opened fire upon enemy troops, killing 6 and wounding as many more. Forced to make a landing and surrounded on all sides by the enemy, who called upon him to surrender, he drew his automatic pistol and defended himself gallantly until he fell dead from a wound in the chest.
In October of 1918, 3 American units, led by Major Charles White Whittlesey, advanced upon German soldiers into the Argonne Forest. Whittlesey was of the understanding that French forces would rendezvous with the American soldiers and flank the Germans from either side. The French forces were delayed, and Whittlesey's men were led into a trap, pinned down from all sides by Germans for 6 days. Flying supplies to the embattled men, Erwin R. Bleckley and Harold E. Gutler, were shot down by German forces. Not only the most iconic fighter ace of World War I, Eddie Rickenbacker is also the only airman to receive the Medal of Honor while still living and actively serving during the Great War. The ace went on to also receive an astonishing 7 Distinguished Service Crosses.
May 19, 1919. Gentlemen, as a stimulus to the courageous aviators, I desire to offer, through the auspices and regulations of the Aero Club of America, a prize of $25,000 to the first aviator of any allied country crossing the Atlantic in one flight, from Paris to New York, or from New York to Paris. All other details in your care. Yours very sincerely, Raymond Ortigue.
In the years after that initial offer, 1919 through 1927, pursuit of the famous Ortigue Prize cost 6 famed aviators their lives, either in attempts to make the famous transatlantic flight or simply in accidents on test flights. By 1927, Charles Lindbergh had been flying for about 5 years, since he was 20 years old. In that time, the young aviator had quickly established himself as a capable and dedicated pilot. He trained as an Air Service Reserve officer and earned his wings on March of 1925 and graduated his training first in his class with the rank of 2nd lieutenant. Since no active duty pilots were required by the Air Service at the time of Lindbergh's commencement, Charles returned to civilian air service as a flight instructor and later became the chief pilot for the contract airmail route from St. Louis, Missouri to Chicago, Illinois, a job in which Lindbergh displayed an almost fanatical dedication. Twice when Lindy had to bail out due to engine problems or harsh weather conditions, his #1 priority was the recovery and speedy delivery of his cargo, the U.S. mail. Lindy's time training with the Air Service and his duties with the Robertson Aircraft Corporation are experiences which the famous aviator would later credit as giving him the focus and the drive to succeed in any goal he put forward, especially his historic attempt at winning the Ortigue Prize with the transatlantic flight made from Roosevelt Field on Long Island, New York, to Le Bourget Field in Paris, France. The achievement was one that would win Lindbergh the Congressional Medal of Honor, as well as usher in more accolades, awards, and acclaim. The fateful flight made an instant celebrity out of Lindbergh, and he used his newfound fame to further spread the acceptance and dependence upon air travel and combat, lecturing to over 30 million people in his years after the historic flight. His celebrity, like that of Eddie Rickenbacker and the flying aces of World War I, helped further the public romance with aviators, this time purveying the idea that air travel was within reach for the civilian, the common man. By the time the United States entered World War II, the U.S. Army Air Corps, as they were now designated, had been developing new, superior aircraft, all suited for different purposes. Bombers, such as the B-17 Flying Fortress, the B-26 Marauder, and the B-29 Super Fortress. Fighters, such as the P-38 Lightning, the P-47 Thunderbolt, and the P-51 Mustang, which came to be known as the trademark of the Tuskegee Airmen, or Red Tails. Transports like the C-46 Commando and the C-47 Skytrain. Trainer aircraft such as the T-6 Texan and the PT-19 planes were used to educate and train airmen, and even wound up seeing some combat. There were, as there always had been in the combat's so far short history, observation and reconnaissance planes, such as the L-2 Grasshopper and the L-5 Sentinel, evolved as photographic technology allowed the planes to be outfitted with newer and better and faster cameras. Reports from Europe in 1939 and 1940 proved the dominant role of the airplane in modern war. On June 20th, 1941, Major General Henry H. Arnold, then Chief of the Air Corps, assumed the title of Chief of Army Air Forces and was given command of the Air Force Combat Command. When the United States officially entered the war, as Arnold's staff saw it, the first priority in the war was to launch a strategic bombing offensive in support of the RAF against Germany. The 8th Air Force, sent to England in 1942, took on that job. After a slow and often costly effort to bring the necessary strength to bear, joined in 1944 by the 15th Air Force stationed in Italy, the 8th finally began to get results. By the end of the war, the German economy had been pounded to rubble. In the war against Japan, General Douglas MacArthur made his advance along New Guinea by leapfrogging his air forces forward, using amphibious forces to open up new bases. The AAF also assisted Admiral Chester Nimitz's carriers in their island hopping across the Central Pacific and supported Allied forces in Burma and China. Arnold directly controlled the 20th Air Force, equipped with the new long-range B-29 super fortresses used for bombing Japan's home islands, first from China and then from the Marianas. Devastated by fire raids, Japan was so weakened by August of 1945 that Arnold believed neither the atomic bomb nor the planned invasion would be necessary to win the war. In addition to James Doolittle's service during the First World War as a flight instructor, he continued to experiment with sustained flight and early navigation instruments. In September 1922, Lieutenant Doolittle accomplished a one-stop flight from Pablo Beach, Florida to San Diego, California in 22 hours and 30 minutes elapsed time, an extraordinary achievement with the equipment available at that time. He helped to develop and test the artificial horizon and directional gyroscope flight instruments, and was responsible for the training of pilots to trust their instruments rather than their senses, which could be inaccurate and distorted during intense flight patterns, like those experienced in battle. In 1929, Doolittle was the first pilot to take off, fly, and land an airplane using instruments alone, without a view outside the cockpit. On December 7, 1941, millions of Americans now knew with absolute certainty that the United States would enter World War II. Over 300 Japanese fighters, bombers, and torpedo planes attacked the U.S. Navy base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, causing the annihilation or damage of American battleships, submarines, and aircraft, and costing over 2,000 American lives. The next day, war was declared on Japan.
The Japanese people had been told they were invulnerable. An attack on the Japanese homeland would cause confusion in the minds of the Japanese people and sow doubt about the reliability of their leaders. There was a second and equally important psychological reason for this attack. Americans badly needed a morale boost.
Four months later, on April 18, 1942, Doolittle planned and led an attack on the Japanese mainland, the very first of the war. 16 B-25 bombers were launched from the USS Hornet, at 8:20 in the morning, 10 hours and 170 miles earlier than planned, due to a Japanese picket boat that had spotted the Hornet and radioed a warning back to Japan. The bombers were all launched successfully, and they hit their targets: 10 military and industrial targets in Tokyo, 2 in Yokohama, and 1 each in Yokosuka, Nagoya, Kobe, and Osaka. None of the bombers were shot down. However, the early takeoff caused each of the bombers problems, and the crews were all forced to bail out of the craft before reaching their landing site in China. 62 out of the 80 airmen made it back to safety. The others were captured or killed by the Japanese. While the attacks did negligible damage to Japan itself, Doolittle's and Roosevelt's main goal, the bolstering of the American morale, was accomplished, and the Japanese forces suffered confusion and loss when units were relocated to protect their homeland. When the company had reconvened, Doolittle was certain that the raid was a complete failure and that the men and aircraft lost in the operation would result in certain court-martial. Far from it. Doolittle was awarded the Medal of Honor. For conspicuous leadership above the call of duty, involving personal valor and intrepidity at an extreme hazard to life, with the apparent certainty of being forced to land in enemy territory or to perish at sea, General Doolittle personally led a squadron of Army bombers manned by volunteer crews in a highly destructive raid on the Japanese mainland. The Doolittle raid proved that American airmen could penetrate Japanese airspace and deliver as strong a blow to their mainland as they had to Pearl Harbor, and thousands of times over. From February to August of 1945, B-29s routinely firebombed Japan's military-industrial complex, destroying aircraft and munitions factories. The raids even included a missed attempt at pumpkin bombing the Imperial Palace. The attacks devastated several Japanese cities, destroying nearly 300,000 buildings in Tokyo and costing an estimation of well over 100,000 lives. In addition to the technological advances made during World War II, some would argue that the beginnings of social advances in America began with the 332nd Fighter Group and the 477th Bombardment Group of the United States Army Air Corps, historically known as the Tuskegee Airmen. The first African Americans to serve as aviators for the United States, the Tuskegee Airmen, so named for the Air Corps training program established at Tuskegee University, an all-black college in Tuskegee, Alabama. Though the units faced harassment from fellow soldiers and even officers, their training, courage, and performance on the field of battle could not be discredited. Their records during the war are exemplary. 150 of the Tuskegee Airmen gave their life serving the United States, but with over 300 missions for the 15th Air Force, over 150 successful bomber escort missions, 112 enemy aircraft destroyed in the air, another 150 on the ground, and 148 damaged, 950 rail cars, trucks, and other motor vehicles destroyed, as well as 40 boats, barges, and 1 destroyer put out of action, the airmen, or red-tailed angels as the bomber crews dubbed them, secured their place in an essential part of aviation and Air Force history. Shortly before entering into World War II, the United States decided that defense of China was beneficial to our country, so aid was dispatched in the form of volunteer Navy, Marine, and Air Force pilots who came to become a unit known as the Flying Tigers. The pilots trained in Burma and at a base in Calcutta, and they, as well as the 10th, 14th, and 20th Air Force squadrons, were responsible for delivering aid to China over the Hump, which became a nickname for the Himalayan mountain range. the United States and Great Britain successfully levied an embargo on Japan, cutting off 90% of their oil supply, while the Flying Tigers in the air and Merrill's Marauders on the ground, responsible for building the Lido Road in 1945, the sole ground route into China that wasn't blockaded by the Japanese, helped the Chinese effectively fight back against the invading Japanese.
America means freedom, and there's no expression of freedom quite so sincere as music.
The attack on Pearl Harbor stirred in many Americans a sense of duty and of a slighted honor that must be restored, and of a longing for peace and an end to the killing in the Second World War. The year following the attack, Glenn Miller, already a popular and successful band leader, enlisted in the United States Army and soon transferred into the Army Air Force, becoming the band leader for the Army Air Force Band. With a goal to entertain the troops, Miller and his Air Force Band hosted a weekly program broadcast by radio to the front lines. They entertained at bases throughout the United States and Europe and recorded records for the Office of War Information. Miller disappeared in December of 1944, flying over the English Channel. His status is still missing in action. Jimmy Stewart had been drafted by the Army in 1940, but was declared unfit for duty for being underweight. Later, after working out with MGM strongman Dan Loomis, Stewart successfully enlisted in the Air Corps, eventually flying over Germany and Nazi-occupied Europe. The film, Winning Your Wings, produced by the unit, featuring Stewart, helped the Air Corps reach their recruiting goal of 100,000 pilots. Stewart went on to serve in the Air Force for over 25 years, winning the Distinguished Service Medal and the Flying Cross, and even flying as a non-duty observer in a B-52 on an arc-light bombing mission during the Vietnam War. Another movie star working for the war effort was the future President of the United States, Ronald Reagan. Reagan was assigned to and served with the 1st Motion Picture Unit from 1944 through 1945, his unit producing over 400 training films. The service of these household names in the Army Air Corps and other branches of the United States military helped to bolster volunteer enlistment and kept those folks back home working towards the war effort. On August 6, 1945, Special Mission 13, consisting of a total of 6 aircraft, flew over Japan with the central goal of dropping the first ever atomic bomb used in battle. Little Boy, as the first bomb was dubbed, was deployed by the Enola Gay, a B-29 Superfortress, and detonated at 1,960 feet above the city of Hiroshima, an industrial and military center of Japan, adjacent to many Japanese army camps and supply and logistics facilities. 3 days later, on the morning of August 9th, another Superfortress, the Boxcar, flew for its intended target, Kokura, which was the site of one of Japan's largest munitions factories. Unfavorable weather conditions rerouted the Boxcar to a secondary target, Nagasaki, one of the largest seaports in southern Japan and home to a host of industrial activity, including the production of ordnance, ships, military equipment, and other war materials. It is estimated that half of the casualties caused in Hiroshima and Nagasaki occurred the instant that the bomb detonated, with the same number of casualties from radiation and after effects of the nuclear strike in the following days, months, and even decades. To this day, the bombing's ethical justifications are debated, but there is no doubt that the actions of the Air Force brought swift surrender from Japan's armies. On May 7, 1949, Henry Hap Arnold became the first and only officer to achieve the rank of General of the Air Force. Arnold overcame an early fear of flying while training with other aviation pioneers, the Wright brothers, and became one of the first rated pilots in the United States military, overseeing the expansion of the air services during World War I under the tutelage of Billy Mitchell. In general, the United States Air Force shall include aviation air forces, both combat and service, not otherwise assigned. It shall be organized, trained, and equipped primarily for prompt and sustained offensive and defensive air operations. The Air Force shall be responsible for the preparation of the air forces necessary for the effective prosecution of war, except as otherwise assigned, and, in accordance with, integrated joint mobilization plans for the expansion of the peacetime components of the Air Force to meet the needs of war. After World War II, it was apparent from issues arising from the Joint Command of the Aviation Branch that the Air Force required autonomy if it was to develop into a useful arm of the United States military. Disputes between Hap Arnold and theater commanders over maneuvers and procedures that later proved beneficial to the American war effort took presidential intervention to override and implement Arnold's winning strategies. From then on, the United States Air Force was its own distinguished branch of the U.S. military. Enlisting as a private in the Army Air Forces, Chuck Yeager quickly enrolled in the pilot training program, coming out of World War II as a flight officer and fighter pilot aboard a P-51 Mustang. After the war, Yeager continued to serve in the AAF and later the newly formed Air Force as a test pilot. On October 14, 1947, piloting the experimental Bell aircraft X-1, Chuck Yeager became the first pilot to break the sound barrier, flying at a speed of Mach 1 at an altitude of 45,000 feet. While his record was later broken by test pilots exceeding Mach 1 and 2, Yeager quickly re-established himself by being the first pilot to reach speeds in excess of Mach 2.44. Ever loyal to his country and his men, Yeager's sense of duty helped to usher in new advances in aerial technology.
We didn't know if we could break the sound barrier, but it was our duty to try. That's the way I looked at it.
As the Yalta Conference guaranteed no rail or road transport of goods or services into the Allied-occupied sections of Berlin after World War II, the Soviets effectively blockaded these avenues of import for goods and supplies. General Lucius D. Clay, who oversaw operations on the U.S. section of Germany, consulted with General Curtis LeMay, commander of the United States Air Forces in Europe, in an effort to subvert the blockade. Clay reportedly asked LeMay, "Can you haul coal?" To which LeMay responded indignantly, "We can haul anything." Because of provisions in writing that there would be 3 20-mile-wide air corridors providing free access to Berlin, the Soviets could not claim any aircraft carrying only basic needs and supplies to be a military threat like that of the tanks, trains, and trucks that would have rolled in via land. By the spring of 1949, it was estimated that an aircraft reached the Allied section of Berlin every 30 seconds, supplying more cargo than previously would have been delivered by land. In an effort to contain what the United Nations saw as the beginning of a domino effect of communist rule, the organization known as the UN officially condemned the North Korean invasion of South Korea on June 25, 1950. 2 days later, President Harry Truman ordered naval and the newly independent Air Force into South Korea to help that nation's defense. By this time, what history came to call the Cold War was already underway. Rumored nuclear development and armament by Soviet and other Axis powers had the United States preparing and training its soldiers for nuclear war. In addition to the advances in weaponry, aircraft innovation saw that the Korean War was the first war that saw the use of jet aircraft in combat. Indeed, by the end of the Korean War, piston and propeller-driven aircraft had been all but retired. New additions to the Air Force fleets included fighters such as the F-82 Twin Mustang, developed during World War II. The last piston-engine aircraft to be produced by the United States demonstrated superior night combat capabilities. The Lockheed F-80C Shooting Star was the aircraft involved in the first jet versus jet air battle on November 8, 1950. The aircraft shot down a MiG-15, a jet aircraft developed by the Soviets and used most famously by the Koreans during this war. However, the MiG later proved to be the superior aircraft. The real star of the jet fighters in Korea was the F-86 Sabre, with a victory ratio of 10-1, shooting down over 700 MiG-15s. Though still unprepared for war in the Pacific, the United States Air Force effectively helped to transport troops, supplies, and equipment from Japan to Korea and held the North Korean armies back while the UN constructed a stable defensive base of operations on the peninsula. 4 airmen received the Medal of Honor in the Korean War, and all of them sacrificed their life for the effort.
If we die, we want people to accept it. We're in a risky business, and we hope that if anything happens to us, it will not delay the program. The conquest of space is worth the risk of life.
In 1958, Gus Grissom was one of 110 military test pilots who was sent a telegram. The communique requested his presence in Washington, D.C. in civilian clothes and told him these instructions were top secret. Grissom had served in the United States Air Force in Korea, as well as the Army Air Forces in World War II. Grissom went on to become not only the second American in space, but the first American to enter space for a second trip. He was part of the Mercury and Gemini programs and was tragically killed during a test launch of the Apollo 1 spacecraft. He was awarded the Congressional Space Medal of Honor, shared with only 27 other outstanding individuals.
Exploration is wired into our brains. If we can see the horizon, we want to know what's beyond.
Another Korean War Air Force ace to enter the space program was Edwin Eugene Buzz Aldrin Jr. Aldrin flew 66 combat missions in F-86 Sabre aircraft, shooting down 2 MiG-15s. In 1963, Aldrin earned his Doctor of Science degree in astronautics at MIT. Later that year, he was chosen as part of the 3rd group of NASA astronauts, and under Commander Neil Armstrong, became the 2nd man to ever walk on the surface of the moon. In 1953, President Dwight D. Eisenhower was being transported in Air Force Flight 8610 when the aircraft entered the space of Eastern Airlines Commercial Flight 8610. The incident only resulted in minor confusion among a few air traffic controllers, but brought to light the need for any presidential aircraft to have its own unique call sign. In 1959, the first official flight of Air Force One occurred. The designation is simply that, a designation. It refers to any aircraft carrying the President of the United States. Currently, 2 specifically configured Boeing aircraft serve as Air Force One. The double-wide jetliners are equipped with sleeping quarters, conference rooms, and both secure and unsecure telephone and telecommunication lines, should the President have to conduct any business while in the air or during a national emergency. After the success of the Berlin airlift, General Curtis LeMay returned to the United States to lead the Strategic Air Command the operation in charge of America's land-based strategic bomber aircraft and land-based intercontinental ballistic missile strategic nuclear arsenal. The unit was founded in 1946, but when LeMay arrived 2 years later, he found that the unit was little more than a collection of World War II surplus B-26 bombers. Over the next 10 years, LeMay transformed the unit into an ever-ready machine, implementing tests of 24-hour bomber and tanker alerts, keeping some bomber forces ready at all times. Most importantly to the United States and the world at the time, LeMay advocated not only preventative, but preemptive nuclear strikes in certain scenarios, even going as far as suggesting that a nuclear war be conducted by delivering the nuclear arsenal in a single, overwhelming blow. Informed still by a great fear of communist sprawl, the United States Air Force had been assisting the South Vietnamese Army since the early 1960s in an effort to stem the rise of communist guerrillas hoping to overthrow Saigon. Maneuvers like Operation Farmgate saw United States airmen serving on South Vietnamese aircraft in an advisory capacity, although in some reports, the U.S. Air Force ran the show. With the Gulf of Tonkin incident, where it was asserted that North Vietnamese Army PT boats had attacked the USS Maddox, the U.S. stepped up its military involvement on land, sea, and air. Operation Rolling Thunder was a program of sustained aerial bombardment that began in the year after the Maddox incident. The strategy behind Operation Rolling Thunder was to seemingly corner important targets by bombing nearby targets in an effort to weaken the NVA's infrastructure and strike a blow to the enemy's morale. Problems arose, however, when the targets, chosen mere hours before in Washington, seemed picked at random and without any apparent regard for the targeting of obvious, usual, and crucial wartime enemy targets. This, coupled with the fact that, since this was the heart of the Cold War, the Air Force pilots had been training for nuclear strikes, not regular bombardment, led to seemingly inefficient and ineffective strikes. Such tactics saw that more bombs were dropped on the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong than were dropped in all of the European and Pacific theaters of World War II. In 1958, the United States Air Force and the Canadian Royal Air Force developed the North American Aerospace Defense Command, or NORAD, an intricate system of satellite and aerial surveillance that would keep the leaders of either country apprised of any maritime or aerospace threat. Aerospace warning includes the monitoring of man-made objects in space and the detection, validation, and warning of attack against North America, whether by aircraft, missiles, or space vehicles, through mutual support arrangements with other commands. The three sectors of NORAD are Alaskan, Canadian, and the continental United States regions. Since 1966, the Cheyenne Mountain Nuclear Bunker has most famously served as a command post for NORAD, and is a 5.1-acre tunneled compound built into the Cheyenne Mountain in order to withstand attack from all foreseeable weapons. In 1986, Libyan agents bombed a nightclub in West Berlin, killing 3 people and injuring over 200. U.S. President Ronald Reagan ordered a strike on Libya 6 days after the attack. The strike unloaded 60 tons of munitions on their targets, and while the United States received support from over 25 countries, including the United Kingdom and Canada, the United Nations officially voted to condemn the action. Libya retaliated by firing 2 Scud missiles at the United States Coast Guard station on the Italian island of Lampedusa, but the missiles overshot and landed harmlessly in the sea. On January 17, 1991, the United States, in coalition with over 20 other nations that opposed Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, launched their first airstrikes in what came to be known as the Gulf War, or Operation Desert Storm. Initial strikes of Tomahawk missiles, as well as F-11 7A Nighthawk stealth bombers, flew the initial missions over Iraq, paving the way for F-14, F-15, F-16, and FA-18 fighter bombers to gain air superiority over the country and then continue to drop TV and laser-guided bombs. The campaign lasted through the next month, dropping 88,500 tons of bombs in one of the first major conflicts that included 24-hour round-the-clock coverage by new media outlets. On February 24th through the 28th, 1991, coalition forces were able to enter Kuwait and beat back the remaining Iraqi forces on the ground, effectively liberating the besieged country. Today, the U.S. Air Force has over 5,778 aircraft commissioned. The men and women of the Air National Guard work in tandem with the United States Air Force, not only providing the Air Force and United States military support in battle, such as in Vietnam, the Gulf War, Kosovo, and Operation Iraqi Freedom, but they also provide support and protection to the United States and its territories. In 2005, the Air Force Militia mobilized 840 personnel in Florida, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas to aid victims of the Hurricane Katrina disaster. In addition, ANG search and rescue pararescue men and combat controllers saved over 1,300 victims of Katrina. Reservists average more than 360 missions away from home each month, supporting other commands and Department of Defense requirements for important fighter, airlift, aerial refueling, rescue, and force projection assets.
There was really no difference between Pearl Harbor and 9/11. In both cases, we let our guard down badly. Complacency will kill you.
On September 11th, 2001, terrorists hijacked a number of commercial passenger planes and flew them into targets in New York City, the World Trade Center, and in Washington, D.C., the Pentagon. In the air, the Civilian Air Patrol, the civilian auxiliary to the United States Air Force, flew aerial reconnaissance over Ground Zero in New York in an effort to provide rescue workers detailed analysis of the wreckage and assist in recovery efforts, including the transport and delivery of blood donations. According to military strategists Harlan K. Ullman and James P. Wade, shock and awe, or rapid dominance, is a military doctrine based on the use of overwhelming power, dominant battlefield awareness, dominant maneuvers, and spectacular displays of force to paralyze an adversary's perception of the battlefield and destroy its will to fight. This strategy, when used in battle, is to
seize control of the environment and paralyze or so overload an adversary's perception and understanding of events that the enemy would be incapable of resistance at the tactical and strategic levels.
The 2003 invasion of Iraq was an effort, according to then President George W. Bush and British Prime Minister Tony Blair, to disarm Iraq of weapons of mass destruction, to end Saddam Hussein's support for terrorism, and to free the Iraqi people. As with the first Persian Gulf conflict, F-117 Nighthawks and air fighters such as the F-15E led the attacks, with bombings from the air clearing the way for a ground invasion of Iraq, eventually liberating the country of the rule of Saddam Hussein. Today, the brave men and women of the United States Air Force continue to strive for excellence as part of the largest and most technologically advanced Air Force in the world. From the cloth balloons of the Civil War to the unmanned aerial vehicles of today, such as the MQ-1 Predator or the MQ-8B Fire Scout, the mission of the United States Air Force remains the same: superiority in the skies. Will the continued development of the new drone aircraft eliminate needless casualties on the field of battle? Or will there always be a place in the sky for the most daring freedom fighter? What new threats might we face as technology advances? And what challenges will the Air Force have to meet and exceed? One thing is for certain: our United States Air Force will continue to
Aim high, fly, fight, win.